Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Juan Vargas. I have the pleasure of discussing today a literature and a conceptual framework about the environmental impact of civil conflict based on a recent policy review paper that I co-author with Oliver Vanden Eynde, who is here with us and who is going to also discuss some of the evidence here in this class. So it's my pleasure to be here. I'm a professor at the University of Turin and the Collegio Carlo Alberto, feel free to use that box of Q&A to ask your questions and comments. So I want to start with this idea that this talk about the effects, the environmental effects of war. So I want to start with this sort of provocative idea that during the Indochina conflict, when the US bombed Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and in addition to lots of bombs, the US also dropped lots of herbicides. About 77 million liters of herbicides were sprayed at a concentration that was 20 times an average agricultural concentration that you would use for agricultural purposes. So a very high concentration with the objective of wiping out sort of crops, but also wiping out the forest in order to leave, to leave less livelihood for the local population and also leave less space for the rebels, and in particular the Viet Cong in Vietnam to hide about. So 5 million acres of forest were destroyed, many of which were crops. About 13 million tons of ordnance were dropped in total, and also almost 500 million tons of napalm. And there's these statistics that is amazing that only in Laos there is a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes for 9 years in continuation. The legacy of that is, of course, in terms of the environment, it's very large, and there are papers that look at the legacy of that in terms of economic activity. But in terms of the environment only, our orange agent and other herbicides, they are very sticky, and 50 years later, dioxin that is measurable in soil, fish, and breast milk in sprayed areas is still a high concentration of that is still existent today. And the bear species in sprayed forests are about 24 today versus almost 10 times that amount in adjacent forests that were unsprayed. So this is perhaps the most extreme case in history, but this talk is not about this sort of historical example. It's more about sort of the causal events, what the causal events of the relationship between conflict and environment says more broadly. Another thing that we're going to emphasize in this talk, that conflict can sometimes and maybe accidentally preserve ecosystems and be good for the environment. So let me give you another historical example. In the strip that is the demilitarized zone that divides North Korea from South Korea, there hasn't been almost any human activity from 1953, and because of that, very rare species have developed. So this is home of Amur leopards, Siberian tigers, and hundreds or even thousands of species that are absent anywhere else in the peninsula. So this is an accidental nature reserve that was created by conflict. So this is called the refugee effect in the literature in conflict ecology, where humans flee or are prohibited from using the land, ecosystems recover, and new species developed. I think we all have witnessed this during the pandemic lockdowns, when we started seeing wolves and wild animals going in the streets of our neighborhoods. But the general idea of this is that the effect of conflict in nature is not monotone, and access costs matter as much as direct destruction. But enough from historical examples. Let me tell you what the roadmap of the presentation is. I'm going to start by saying that identification is hard. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Colombia and then Africa in general. And then we're going to jump to other examples of this pressing question. Okay, finally, we're going to end with some open questions and policy implications and discussion. Feel free, as I said, to use the Q&A box. So let me just say first that this talk emphasizes causation, so identify papers, not only correlation. So we know that war is bad for nature. That's obvious in a sense. The sort of Indochina example is very eloquent in that direction. But we don't know how bad, through what mechanisms. So we're going to focus on papers that take identification seriously and that tell us, with precise how big are these estimates and what are the mechanisms. And as a spoiler, I'm going to tell you that there is no tons of evidence about this. So this is also an invitation for the audience to do research in this context. So why is it that identification is hard? Before jumping to that, let me just tell you that the stakes are very high. Conflict and nature overlap everywhere. So in the right, you see for 2022 maps, the one on top is the death rate in armed conflicts based on where they have occurred. And you see that there's high concentration in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and part of South Asia, and also Latin America. In the bottom map, you see annual deforestation in the same year, 2020. And you can see already there's a lot of visual correlation between the two measures. Does this prove anything? No, it doesn't. But at least this correlation should motivate some questions that we're going to try to answer. But 40% of tropical forests in the world are in countries with active armed conflicts, and conflicts have taken place in 2/3 of the world's biodiversity hotspots. So, for instance, what you see there in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, show that. Countries at war tend to be countries with high deforestation, lots of pollution, erosion, water contamination, and a lot of biodiversity loss. But this is hard to identify because the causal order runs in both ways. Conflict is bad for the environment, but also the environment or environmental pressure triggers conflicts and generates more conflict. So for this talk and this sort of broader sort of double causation is something that we discussed in the policy paper that I wrote with Oliver. In this talk, we're going to focus on the arrow that goes from conflict to the environment. Okay. So this is the question of where we're going to be asking whether this red arrow or orange arrow exists, whether there's a causal effect, and how large it is. But this is a very difficult question to answer because it turns out that the arrow goes in both directions, and not only that, but also there's a bunch of institutional factors or development factors or other characteristics in societies that may be the cause of both conflict and environmental damage. So these are omitted variables that if we don't take into account, it's difficult to identify what's the causal effect of conflict on the environment. So as I mentioned, there are two threats. One is omitted variables, so poverty, institutional vacuums, etc., are causes of both conflict and potentially environmental damage. And also, as I mentioned before, there's reverse causality. The arrow can be going in the opposite direction. So the solutions that have been used in the literature, in the absence of the possibility of running randomized experiment in this realm because of ethical reasons, are using sources of variation that allow for causal identification with observable data like instrumental variables, difference in differences, or event study comparisons, or regression discontinuity comparisons, for instance, of protected areas versus not protected areas. So let me talk about these areas, starting with Colombia. This is a country that has been studied sufficiently in terms of the relationship between conflict and environment. If anything, because it's the only conflict in the Western Hemisphere that has had a civil war for over 60 years. So this is a paper that I myself wrote with Leopoldo Ferguson and Daria Romero some 10 years ago about the environmental impact of civil conflict, and in particular, whether the paramilitary expansion in Colombia generated deforestation. So the question that we ask is whether the nationwide expansion of pro-extractive land use businesses, paramilitary militias that expanded from the northwest of the country to the rest of the country in the early 1990s, with the formation of something that is called the United Self-Defense Militias of Colombia, generated deforestation. If you run just a little less sort of descriptive specification, that yields a negative correlation, which implies that more paramilitary presence is associated with less forest loss, with less deforestation. And why is that? Well, because there's selection. In the world, armed groups thrive in places in which there are dense jungles, where the state presence is relatively low, and they find a safe haven to hide. So in terms of identification, and apologies for the typo, we estimate an instrumental variable approach that exploits the distance to Urabá. Urabá is a region in the northwest of Colombia, from which the paramilitary expanded in the early 1990s to the rest of the country. And people don't like these distance instruments, and they're right, because distance can be correlated with many other things. But we show a nice falsification, which is that the instrument ceases to be relevant during the period in which the paramilitary demobilized. So the instrument is only relevant for a period in which this group was active. So we essentially find that the paramilitary expansion in Colombia significantly increases deforestation. So it's the opposite effect as the one that you find in terms of just a statistical correlation. And the mechanism is that they generate violence, displacement, land dispossession, that allows these groups that are pro-extractive land use businesses to engage in illegal mining, cattle ranching, and cocoa cultivation and other extractive activities. So deforestation occurs not through the fighting, but just through the land use change that follows the displacement and the dispossession of the territories that the paramilitaries seize. So essentially, the one that they're in the bottom is of the causal path of our findings. There's another paper on Colombia that asks a similar question, but in an event that goes in the opposite direction. So the first paper looks at the expansion of paramilitary militias to the entire conflict in the early 1990s. This paper looks at something that happened some 20 years afterwards, or more than 20 years afterwards, which is a peace agreement. And a peace agreement that happened between the government of Colombia and the main rebel organization of the country, which is the FARC. This is a paper that I published in World Development with Munu Prema and Santiago Saavedra. And essentially, the idea here is that during peace negotiations with FARC that started in 2012, the main milestone before the actual reaching a peace agreement in 2016 was a unilateral permanent ceasefire that FARC declared in December 2013, which we use to compare FARC-controlled municipalities relative to other municipalities and look at deforestation. For deforestation, we use the Global Forest Change, which is a publicly available data set that allows you to measure at a fine pixel grain sort of tree coverage. And we find that informally FARC-controlled strongholds prior to this agreement, the ceasagreement triggered a differential increase in deforestation after the ceasefire. That was attenuated, so there's a heterogeneous effect in which the effects are smaller in places with more state presence, and is amplified in places by land-intensive activities. Okay? So the one in the right is a map of Colombia, and is a map of what parts of Colombia have still forest cover and what parts of Colombia have completely been deforested. In terms of identification, we use a difference in differences strategy. So if you look in there to a left picture here, you see sort of the raw data, the evolution of forest loss, deforestation levels between municipalities with the presence of FARC and municipalities without the presence of FARC. And you see that prior to the ceasefire, the evolution is very parallel between the two sets of places. After the peace agreement, deforestation increases in both type of places. So the peace agreement generated lots of incentives for new economic activities to go to the entire country in Colombia. So Colombia started growing very fastly, in part because of extractive activities. But the fact that the wedge between the two lines increases in favor of the municipalities with FARC presence shows that the increase in deforestation is differentially larger in places that used to be FARC strongholds. We show that more formally in the right-hand side, which is an event study plot that showed that there is a differential increase in terms of deforestation in places with FARC presence, before the ceasefire relative to other places. Something important of this paper is whether we ask whether this differential increase in deforestation that we observe is of small patches of deforestation, so it's very granular, which would be consistent with small farmer-based deforestation because of the fact that lots of people were dispossessed and flee their land during the conflict. It might be the case that some of these people return after the ceasefire and started growing stuff in their land, and the deforestation is caused by that. Or it could be that deforestation is large-scale extraction or massive deforestation by agro-businesses that take advantage of the fact that there is now no rebel group in the area and start deforesting. So we actually, because we have very fine grain level data at the pixel level in 30 meters times 30 meters, we can back out the size of the patches of deforestation, and we actually conclude that the deforestation that we observe is of the later type. So it's massive deforestation driven not by farmers who are returning, but driven by uncontrolled or unmonitored big economic exploitation businesses. And for instance, we show that the effects are larger in places with less monitoring capacity of the state. So the conclusion of this is that there is this sort of peace paradox, right? Conflict can unintendedly promote environmental conservation, and FARC acted de facto as an environmental authority, not because they care about protecting the environment, no, not because it was the objective of the guerrilla to do that, but rather because it's costly to engage in economic activity in places under the control of rebel organizations. But this observation is not specific to Colombia. This is not because Colombia is a crazy place, right? We observe this in other parts of the world. So let me tell you a little bit about Africa. In Africa, pretty much the same happened, for instance, in Sierra Leone. There's this paper that precedes our paper by Miguel Burgess and Stanton, publishing environmental research letters. Their setting is the RUF rebellion in Sierra Leone between 1991 and 2002. And they actually look at the movement of the RUF across chiefdom during the Civil War, and measure sort of land cover and forest cover before the start of the war and after the end of the war. Compare places in which the rebel organization have moved in and places that were not, had never seen sort of the presence of the rebel organization. They do this by OLS using geographic controls, original rebel camp locations, and quasi-random, which are quasi-random conditional and covariates. And they essentially find something very similar, which is that conflict, so chiefdom that were affected by conflict, experience less forest loss relative to other places. Why is that? Because in places affected by conflict, the road infrastructure deteriorated, timber extraction became impossible because of the violence and sort of the extortion carried out by these groups, and therefore extractive investments fled the country, and in particular those areas, right? So this just means that context is very important when understanding this phenomena. So it's similar to the case in Colombia. In Sierra Leone, conflict protected forests by eliminating access to investments. Okay. In Angola, for instance, there's a classic paper in the AR by Eliana La Ferrara and Massimo Guidolin that has a nice title. It's called "Diamonds Are Forever Wars or Not." Essentially, what they show in that paper is that when the leader of the rebels, Savimbi, died unexpectedly in February 2002, the stock price of firms exploiting diamonds in Angola dropped relative to similar firms investing in diamonds in other countries. Okay, so essentially the peace, so the fact, so the death of Savimbi, by the way, marked the beginning of the end of the rebel organization in Angola. So this finding, which is a very sort of financial markets type of paper, looking at excess returns at the firm level for firms with diamonds in Angola versus in other countries, and show that after the death of Savimbi, those of diamonds in Angola drop relative to others. This find suggests that peace is bad news for incumbent firms in places in which conflict creates entry barriers, so it makes it more difficult to compete for businesses, and where the government is very weak and has very little bargaining power. So there is little transparency, and firms benefit from insider sort of deals with, for instance, rebel organizations. So in particular, Savimbi, afterwards it was discovered that Savimbi was a billionaire in part because of the sort of payments that he had received from diamond companies from protecting their industry. The research also shows that environmental regulation is good news, even in places with bad institutions or with weak institutions, and even during conflict. So there's a relatively new paper in the Journal of Peace Research that shows that in DRC, where there's ongoing conflict, especially in the East DRC, and there's lots of artisanal and industrial mining. It's a country rich in minerals. A reform in 2011, from 2011 to 2013, that created independent monitoring of mining firms. This reform was implemented at arbitrary grid-based boundaries of mines. So in order to compare mines inside places under the monitoring system with mines outside, they do this difference in geographic discontinuities, which is a different like the one I explained by comparing places inside a polygon in which there is monitoring with places just outside that polygon, and they essentially show that there's a large reduction in deforestation inside the mining zones, even in areas with continued armed conflict. Okay, so this just means that environmental regulation is promising, and we're gonna discuss a little bit more about policy afterwards. There's also evidence about how mining generates negative externalities on local ecosystems, which are amplified in contexts of conflict and with regulation. There's a paper by Aragon and Root in the Economic Journal that studies large gold mine in Ghana and shows that this mine pollutes the surrounding water and soil, therefore lowering nearby agricultural productivity. And the effect is very local. It attenuates sharply with distance to the mine. There's another paper that looks at mine-driven water pollution in the entire Africa, comparing places upstream and downstream the location of mines, and essentially saying that the pollution that mines create travel along the river network and therefore create cross-community and cross-border negative externalities. So essentially the point here is that pollution destroys rural livelihoods via sort of reducing the opportunity cost, and therefore are exacerbated during instances of conflict. So mining might trigger violence indirectly, but this link is not yet causally identified. So this is just telling you that the arrow in the other direction also exists and can be investigated. So you have to be careful in trying to identify causation from correlations. So mining activity drives deforestation, especially in the context of conflict. There's a new paper by Girard, Molina Millán, and Vig that show that artisanal mining, when coupled with adverse weather shocks, trigger deforestation in Africa. And this is so the two shocks together are amplified, which illustrates this sort of complex intertwined relationship between climate resources and conflict operating simultaneously, which is, by the way, the topic of our review paper with Oliver. Essentially, the mechanism here is that resource rents create conflict that reduces the capacity of regulation, which create more unregulated mining and therefore more deforestation, reducing the livelihood of people and therefore decreasing the opportunity cost of engaging in armed conflict. So I mean, this is just to show the sort of the complexity of the problem. Now I'm going to turn it to Oliver.
Okay, so I'm going to take over here to talk a bit more about kind of the scope for policies to influence mining activity. and potentially some of the impacts that mining activity has on conflict. So Juan referred earlier to this regulation that was introduced in the DRC, and that seemed to have been relatively effective in that context. Another important policy tool that governments could use in principle are the royalties or are linked to the royalty systems that typically exist for mining activities. So royalties are essentially like a tax that is levied on mining production, which can benefit different levels of government. And often there are like quite a bit of subtleties in terms of who exactly benefits or benefits most from these resources. So, for example, in Nigeria, there are allocations based on oil production, which to a large extent benefit local governments. In Colombia, like municipalities benefit actually quite a lot from the mining resources or the natural resources more broadly, including oil in their territory. But in India, which I'm going to talk about later on, it was actually mostly the central government, at least historically, who benefited from these royalties. In any case, these royalties, they're taxes, and so they're kind of a classical public policy instrument that governments can use to try to steer mining activity, especially in a context where mining activity can kind of like, have impacts or interact with conflict in the complex way that Juan described on the previous slide. And so interestingly, like the evidence we have on the impact of these type of tools is not that straightforward or seems like to be conflicting at first. So there is one paper by Saavedra and Romero, which looks at like a change in the royalty system in Colombia that led to municipalities getting less royalty revenue. And so they find that this change actually led to an increase in illegal mining, which is where the mechanism here is very intuitive. So the idea, so because royalties they're taxed almost by or sorry, they're based almost by definition on legal mining activity. Therefore, if you reduce the tax on legal activity, you may end up promoting illegal activity. Now, one of the limitations of this paper is that because this tax or the change in the royalty regime apply to all Colombian mines at the same point in time, they cannot really use kind of within country variation in their empirical design. And for the same reason, they cannot really assess what the effect is of this change on conflict. So in fact, in their empirical design, they end up comparing Colombian mines to mines in Peru. However, there's another paper on this topic, which is one that I co-authored with Jake Shapiro, where we look at a similar policy change, but in India. And interestingly, the policy change here actually just applied to one specific mineral at a given point in time. So historically, as I already hinted at in India, it was actually mostly the central government, so the government in Delhi, that used to collect all the mining royalties. But at some point in 2009, they decided that for iron ore in particular, they would shift to a new type of regime where actually the state governments ended up benefiting a lot more from the royalties on mining activity in their territory. And so this was a big shock. Like for some states, this was like, they got like additional revenue from mining activity that was bigger than 1% of the state GDP. And so even like an even higher percentage, of course, from the budget of these state governments. So suddenly mining activity became like very high stake for these governments. And this actually happens in an area, or this affects an area of India that is conflict affected, or that at least like used to be conflict affected at the time. because we're focusing here on the Maoist conflict, which is actually still ongoing and affects a large area of central India, but which in recent years has become like a bit less violent than it used to be around like 2009, which is the period, the time period that we focus on in this study. What we observe is kind of interesting. So we see first of all, and that's like roughly the panel that is on the left. What we see is that after the royalty change, and in areas that have kind of production of iron ore, we see an intensification of the conflict. And so this is consistent with a lot of simple theories of conflict, where you predict that if you increase the stakes of the conflict, in this case, this concerns the legal stakes of the state through the royalties, you may expect to see more contestation and more violence. And so this effect seems to be there. It's very strong. Initially, it potentially kind of becomes a bit weaker after like a long time, like roughly after 4 years, the effect seems to be fading out a bit. But what is interesting is that in this setting, we can also try to look at how this kind of change affects illegal mining activity. Because one of the original motivations for giving the states a bigger stake was exactly that, kind of getting back to the intuition that I already described in the context of Colombia. You might think that by giving the states a bigger stake, they would actually have an incentive to promote legal activity more at the cost of or at the benefit of reducing illegal activity. However, this is not really what we find. Before I talk about results, I should probably say a bit more about measurement here, which is of course not obvious, right? Like, how do you measure the extent of illegal activity? So, like the paper on Colombia that I described earlier, like one of our main measures will be based on satellite observations. In particular, what you can do is you can compare if a mine exists administratively or legally, and whether that mine is visible, or if you see a mine on satellite imagery. If you see a mine on the satellites that is not in the administrative data, then you may be talking about an illegal mine. Now, this is very intuitive, but like in many countries, illegal mining is not really a black and white kind of distinction, as I described it. Very often, illegal mining takes place in mines that are partly legal, and it takes the form of actually mining more than you're legally allowed to. And so this is what we call excess mining. It's mining beyond the surface for which a mine has a legal lease. Now, for this type of mining, like you can also derive a measure based on satellite observations, but the construction of this measure is a lot more complex. What you can do there is you can compare the size of the mine that you measure on the satellite image to the size of the mine as it is recorded in the administrative data. And so this is exactly what we do in our study, and we use this comparison to develop very simply a 0-1 measure of whether you have excess mining in a given location at a given point in time. And we then look whether after the introduction of this higher royalty rate for iron ore, in iron ore mines as compared to other mines, so for example, bauxite mines or coal mines, which are not affected directly by the royalty change, whether these iron mines see any change in the extent or in the probability of illegal mining activity. And so what we observe is that, perhaps surprisingly, if anything, there's an increase in illegal mining. Similarly, so we can develop other measures of illegal mining activity. So another way in which kind of mining mines can operate illegally is by continuing activity when the mine is legally closed. So mines to operate legally, they need to have an active lease. If this lease has expired, in principle, there should not be activity. But anecdotally, we know that quite often these leases are not respected, and activity continues even if there's no formal active lease. And so what the measure we construct then to capture this type of illegal activity is we can measure from satellite images whether there are trucks in the mine when the mine is formally closed according to the administrative data. And similarly, we see that according to this measure, at least for a couple of years, there seems to be a higher probability of illegal activity in iron ore mines after the introduction of this high royalty rate. So how can we kind of as I said, earlier in the context of the Colombian case, there, the results seem to be pretty intuitive. So the state gets more revenue from legal mining, so therefore it promotes legal mining at the expense of illegal mining. How can we explain that in another context we see different patterns, namely that illegal mining seems to increase when we give states a higher stake? So to make sense of these type of results, you can refer to models of tax collection, where it's actually a well-known result that if you give a higher stake to the tax collector, this may also actually kind of increase the bargaining position of the tax collector and allow them to generate more rents, because they have in their negotiation with kind of people who may want to bribe the tax collector, they actually have a better position. And if this channel is sufficiently strong, in some contexts, you may actually see that by giving the tax collector a bigger stake, they generate more revenue, but also on the side, they also generate more bribes and potentially more kind of illegal activity. So this would be one explanation for this phenomenon. More broadly, this highlights that the same type of policy can have different effects in different environments, and this is something we'll get back to later. Okay, so sorry, I'm moving too quickly. But I don't have control over the slides, I think. Is that true? No. Okay. So yeah, you can go forward to the next slide, and then the next one. Yeah. So okay. So moving from policy instruments, we're now going to talk a bit more about military activity, and it's linked to environmental kind of outcomes, because again, kind of. Military spending and military activity also affects kind of overall economic activity, and through that channel could have an effect on environmental outcomes. So an interesting paper in this context is a very recent paper by Liang, Rudik, and Zhu, who measure or who use military spending in the US as an instrument for economic activity. So in particular, they use something they use what is essentially a shift share design, where they take a state's initial military spending and they multiply that with national, so US level procurement shocks. And so this will for them act as an instrument for local economic activity. The idea here is that at a local level, this creates the national procurement policies in combination with whether or not at baseline you had more or less military, a more or less important military sector locally. This combination of this shock and this initial share provides exogenous variation in economic activity. Of course, at level of the US, more or less military spending is not going to be exogenous. It's linked to perhaps the political context, the trade exposure, etc. But at the local level, these shocks should be relatively random and exogenous to kind of local conditions. What they then do is they construct a data set of that roughly captures the quality of the environment in a location. So they use this data set called biotime, which provides like ecological observations for different species across the US at a relatively granular level. And what they then find is that if they use this instrument, they find that economic activity reduces biodiversity by reducing the number of species, like the number of kind of animals for a given species or plants, and also their stability. And if they try to kind of kind of pin down a channel, they find that air pollution is actually the most important kind of like explanation for why they observe this effect, this negative effect of economic activity on environmental outcomes. Now, they also document that the Clean Air Act, which is a piece of regulation that's protecting air quality, actually helped to mitigate these impacts. And so this again shows that regulation in some contexts can be kind of effective in mitigating impacts. What is interesting about this paper for our purpose, of course, is that this links to this links economic activity to kind of conflict or military activity. So conflict like necessarily goes hand in hand with a kind of military buildup, and military buildup, like any kind of sector in the economy, is likely to lead to a kind of certain environmental impacts, which are not necessarily which may not be negligible at all, as is the case in the US. Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so there's like throughout the talk, actually, there I mean, there are some results that at first sight appear to be a bit kind of contradictory, right? So I already talked about these results on mining royalties going in opposite directions in Colombia and in India. Juan earlier in the talk was focusing on two security or two conflict shocks in some sense and their effects on deforestation. And so there we found that even in the same context, the conflict in Colombia, we saw effects going in different directions. So the kind of the paramilitary shock appeared to kind of reduce deforestation, increase deforestation, whereas the shock of the end of the conflict also seemed to lead to increased deforestation. So these are potentially kind of results that appear a bit conflicting at first sight. But one way to think about it, or one conceptual framework that can help us to think about these type of effects, is that we can think that civil conflict operates through different channels. So the first channel through which civil conflict operates is to raise access costs by making it harder to build or to use roads, by kind of reducing movements, perhaps from fear of extortion or even violence or exposure to landmines. So these kind of kind of channels can explain why conflict in some cases can protect forests, which may also account for why areas where the FARC was strong were initially less deforested, and then the peace agreement, of course, for that reason led to a catch up, right? So that's the result that Juan talked about earlier. It's the same logic as for why the Korea border is this kind of unique kind of biodiversity hotspot. But then, like, conflict can also affect kind of the environment through alternative channels, and in particular, it could be that, like, the displacement and land grabs by armed groups in themselves contribute to deforestation. So this is like a channel that can account for the effect of the paramilitaries in Colombia that Juan talked about earlier. Then a third channel through which conflict could operate is that it could lead to kind of a weaker institutional environment and a collapse of regulation. And so that might account for why we observe in the context of civil conflict often illegal mining and pollution. And of course, it's reasonable to think that, like, problems of pollution may be particularly severe in illegal mines. So which exact mechanism will dominate will typically depend on, like all elements of the context. So who exactly fights, like what are the resources that we talk about? Resources may not be different in terms of, or may not be identical in terms of their environmental impacts or in terms of the rents that they generate for the groups who are involved in conflict, and therefore the kind of their pull potential may be quite different as well. Also, like, state capacity may be different in different settings. And if we think about the end of conflict, it's of course important to know who exactly fills in the power of vacuum and what their incentives are. Also, like, on top of all of that, also the geography matters. So all of this is just to say that, in practice, as in almost any setting, as in almost any conflict-affected setting, there are going to be like a lot of kind of idiosyncratic characteristics of the environment that could all kind of make certain channels more or less important in that particular context. And so, as always, as economists like studying conflict, we need to be very modest in terms of how generalizable our claims are, and we need to carefully think about what is the exact setting that we're studying, and based on their characteristics, what makes it what makes one or the other channel more important in that setting. Okay, so this slide is just summing up what we think we know about this kind of topic of conflict, kind of and the environment. So I think what is relatively well established is that conflict can at the same time harm and protect ecosystems. Which also implies almost necessarily that depending on the setting, peace may not necessarily be green, in the sense that in the at the end of conflict there could be an extractive rush, as Juan documented in Colombia. However, there's also evidence that is more hopeful. In particular, this evidence on the mining reform in the DRC, which showed how if environmental regulation can work even during an ongoing conflict. Biodiversity could also be affected by the economic booms or shocks that are driven by military activities. So this is something that we know from the US. And finally, as in the case of Angola, firms may actually, in some cases, have an incentive to perpetuate conflict. In particular, because the conflict kind of it creates this environment with weak regulation, which firms may ultimately benefit from, possibly at the expense of the environment. But there's a whole set of open questions that we think should be on the agenda of future research. So first of all, it seems very intuitive that the pollution that comes from mining activity could be a trigger of conflict, right? Because we know that in many settings, threats to people's economic livelihoods kind of spur participation in conflict. And so through the same channel, we should expect that if there's a lot of pollution from mining activity, this should undermine economic kind of conditions, and therefore that could feed into conflict. This is an intuitive channel, but it has not really been shown yet in the literature. Another important source of biodiversity that we didn't really talk about today are oceans and the marine ecosystems. These could also be affected by conflict, but are heavily understudied. Similarly, wildlife recovery in and after during conflict and after peace, this is really an open area for research. And also, biodiversity loss could be actually an important channel to explain, for example, the link between climate change and conflict, right? Because often if we think about climate change, the channel that we have in mind is similar to the channel that I described earlier, where climate shock leads, for example, to a kind of more frequent droughts, and we know that droughts they tend to undermine agricultural income, and through that channel generate conflict. However, if climate change leads to an accumulation of droughts, it could also be that climate change changes the natural environment and biodiversity, and that this creates an additional channel through which kind of climate shocks kind of feed into conflict. Or in other words, drought shocks may actually have bigger effects on economic livelihoods if in the long run they are accompanied with a loss in biodiversity. These are channels that seem intuitive, but they have not been identified and documented yet in the empirical literature. The other another open question is what we can say about the intensity of conflict. So often the comparisons that we make in the existing work are questions of having any conflict or no conflict in a given area or at a given point in time, but the reality of many of these environments, this is the case for Colombia or for India and for many ongoing conflicts in Africa. Conflict is often not a 0-1 state. It's something that that affects large areas over long periods of time, and where there are changes in the intensity. And I think we need to do better in understanding what the relevant dose responses are. So how does the intensity of conflict, as opposed to the extent, matter for environmental outcomes? Okay, so just a few things about policy implications. So this is something that we already touched on, but one first policy implication that comes from this work is that when we think about peace agreements, we should also kind of incorporate environmental considerations. So for example, again, in the case of Colombia, where we saw this uptick in deforestation in kind of areas where the FARC was stronger. So this is something that could have been anticipated better in the peace agreement, and in particular, it calls for agreements where there are provisions that help the states or the state, in its single form, kind of strengthen institutions, when armed groups leave, to make sure that there is not this kind of extractive rush that has been documented in a variety of settings. Second policy implication is that monitoring can sometimes be relatively cheap and effective. So this was the case of the monitoring of mining activity in the DRC that we talked about. The third policy kind of implication or policy point to keep in mind is that there could be big returns to regulating firms, and so not just focus on combatants, like this is evidence that we didn't really talk about today, but that like if you go to our overview paper, we actually talk a lot about like, you know, international regulation and how that changes the impact of mining activity on conflict. And there's like, you know, like a substantial body of evidence, you know, today that seems to suggest that like international regulation, like the Frank Act or the corresponding EU regulation, are actually relatively effective in mitigating the impact of like natural resource extraction on conflict. And so more broadly, there's like, you know, like there's a broad scope for governments and international organizations to kind of regulate firms or to require transparency. And this could be like an important tool to develop. Fourth policy lesson from what we discussed is that, like, you know, military activity also has environmental costs, you know, including through greenhouse emissions. And so what's interesting to note is that the Paris Agreement, for example, makes an exception for military spending, but like in many countries, this could be like, you know, this could leave like significant shares of the economy out of the scope of the agreement. And with increasing defense budgets, this kind of like, you know, this gap becomes like even more relevant. And then finally, as we already said, like, you know, the link between biodiversity and livelihoods is something that really deserves more attention. Also, like, you know, from a perspective of conflict prevention. Okay, and I think this is everything we wanted to say. So I think like you know the our conclusion from like you know reviewing this evidence is that the environment is can clearly be a silent victim of war, even though it sometimes can also be an accidental beneficiary. So I think this is the end of like the lecture that we had prepared. But obviously we're very happy to take a few more questions if there are any. Um, so so I think I'm looking at the questions in the chat. So the first question is about like what types of mining extraction are vulnerable to deforestation. So perhaps Juan, like you may want to respond to that because you've worked like most directly on deforestation.
Yes. Yes. No, that's a great question, and I think that I think there is really not like to the best of my knowledge like any causal paper that looks at different types of mines and deforestation. There is a lot of work on different types of mines and other environmental outcomes and different types of mines and conflict, and also how different types of mines interact with climate shocks. But the particular question that you're asking, which is what is the relationship between different types of mines and deforestation, is not something that I know has been studied. It from my knowledge and from my own work, I think that these sort of open air pits are more likely to exacerbate deforestation, if anything, because uh, conditional on there not being a sufficient enforcement or monitoring, they tend to become larger and larger over time, especially if the mineral that is exploited is profitable and the price is high. So in the absence of enforcement or regulation of other sides, these open air pits tend to grow and you know and create forest loss in the surroundings relative to mines underground, let's say. But that's my intuition from my knowledge of the topic.
I agree with Juan that I mean in the sense that I think this question is a bit under researched. In particular, also if you think about like the distinction between artisanal mining and industrial mining, because you might think that like artisanal mining, because of its lower scale, like maybe associated with less deforestation, but at the same time, like artisanal mining is much harder to regulate than industrial mining. And so it's not obvious, like I would say, but I would find it very interesting actually to see more research on this. Um, Another question. Oh, sorry. Like you want to
No, I
follow up?
was I was looking at the second question, and it's also a great question. Thank you so much, Grace. So essentially, your question is whether whether there are studies on the environmental costs of conflict in terms of direct environmental damage from conflicts, for instance, after bombardments. So what I can tell you is that there is a lot of literature on the effects of these type of sort of long and sustained and very intense levels of conflict activity, in particular based on the Indochina case study of the large amount of bombings that were dropped by the US in the 70s on uh, economic outcomes such as agricultural productivity. However, I know that doesn't answer your question, but however, many of these economic outcomes, and in particular agricultural productivity, are mediated by environmental factors, right? So the scholars that have looked at these are mainly economists. There's also work by a very good political scientist, Erin Lin, on this for Cambodia. And they look at environmental productivity, but many of the channels have to do with, for instance, forest loss or biodiversity loss that ultimately decreases long-term agricultural productivity. Also, in other papers have shown that there has been catch-up of bombed areas with other areas in terms of other type of activities. There is a long-term cost in terms of agricultural productivity, and some of the channels have to do with environmental degradation. And then the third question I haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I think the third question is essentially like kind of giving more details. So about this kind of incorporating military greenhouse emissions. So I think we can move to the fourth question, which is about kind of like colonial consequences, as in Haiti and like I mean I guess you could see this more broadly, like and also think about like the pollution that comes from kind of multinational organizations and use of pesticides. Um, I think there's an interesting question, of course, which is like to which extent is this type of pollution different from other types of pollution? Or is there something about institutions that makes, for example, the distributional impact of this pollution different from whether it occurs in a context that is like, not the one of a colonial a kind of regime, or like linked to the operations of a multinational organization. So I think these are kind of I think that it's mostly like through differences in the distributional impacts that I would see this type of legacy as being different from exposure to pollution in a generic sense, right? Because I think that's the key kind of question here. Is if it's important to take into account the fact that at the root of environmental issues there is this colonial legacy. But I haven't seen a lot of work like, or any work actually, like kind of investigating this explicitly. And so in terms of policy recommendations, unfortunately, I also don't have great ideas except from potentially encouraging you and others to start working on this on this topic. But as I said, it's very important to to identify precisely through which channel this colonial legacy would operate, right? And my guess would be that the most likely relevant candidate would be the distributional impacts of pollution in terms of which exact groups or regions were affected.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess another channel is that in these contexts, Sub-Saharan Africa, but Latin America and the Caribbean. So for the case of Haiti, another consequence of colonial legacy is weak, a very generalized weak institutional environment, right? Which creates the seed for lack of regulatory and enforcement and monetary capacity to sort of reduce the type of activities that generate more pollution and environmental degradation. And then the final question here is a great question by Fernanda Gutierrez. Um, I love this question. I don't think I have an answer to it, but it's whether there is evidence that the conflicts that are linked to extractive activities that generate local income, whether the income gains attenuate the negative effects of the environmental degradation on welfare. I mean, this is a super difficult question to answer. If anything, and let me give you an example, because it's very difficult to compare costs and benefits. In particular, because benefits might be sort of concentrated in a handful of people. So the people, these income generating activities that are associated with conflict and environmental degradation tend to be mineral exploitation, which in many cases are not, which are capital intensive and in any case are associated with little distribution and the income is concentrated. The costs are much more widespread. In particular, if you think about costs in terms of conflict, but also in terms, as you point in your question, in terms of environmental degradation. So environmental degradation is not only much more widespread, but also much more intergenerational, right? So that comparison into sort of realized income that is very concentrated relative to a cost that is widespread both in terms of space and time makes it your question difficult to answer, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was also thinking again about royalties, which are I mean, there's definitely a tendency for kind of royalties to benefit more. I mean, Colombia potentially being an exception to this, but there is this idea that royalty income should benefit much more than is typically the case or currently the case, the local communities around the mining sites. Which seems very intuitive because this is generating, in some sense, a financial kind of mechanism that could compensate for these environmental impacts that are often concentrated on these local communities. The problem, though, is that these royalties they operate in relatively complex ways because by concentrating them locally you may actually also generate rents locally which attract conflict in itself. So Juan's papers on the oil and the coffee price shocks, the oil effect to a large extent is driven there by the fact that local municipalities sit on these rents from royalty income. And designing these tools carefully to like, you know, to make sure that these income gains actually reach the local population and could potentially kind of compensate for some of these effects. Like, you know, that is something that, like, you know, that is very hard. And I don't think we have, like, you know, sufficient evidence in the literature to be sure about how exactly to do this.
Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, these were great questions. Yeah, so I think like we can close the lecture now, right? So thank you everyone for participating. Um, and like you know, as you know, there is like another lecture next week at the same time. So in particular, so the next one will be on gender inequality and conflict by Sue Anderson. So we really hope that you'll be able to attend like that lecture as well. Okay, thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.